That door was locked for a reason. Not to keep people out, to keep the truth from getting loose. 15 bodies in that parlor, and every one of them pretending they weren't scared. You could hear it in the quiet. The kind of quiet that shows up right before somebody gets robbed or buried. The lawyer sat at the front like a man about to light a fuse. Wax seal in his fingers, paper thick as money. He didn't look at anybody at first. He just broke it open slow, like he knew the room might explode. Colonel Edmund Blackwood had been dead 3 days. Big man, big land, big pockets, cotton money heavy enough to bend a family's spine. Folks whispered his fortune like a prayer. $200,000, they said, and a plantation so wide it had its own weather. His widow sat stiff in black, grief painted on her face like powder. But I've seen grief before. This wasn't that. This was ownership. Her boy, Richard, leaned forward like the words were already his. 32, grown, still hungry. The kind of hungry that don't come from an empty stomach. It comes from believing the world owes you interest. The daughter, Catherine, did her little handkerchief show, dabbing at eyes that weren't wet enough. She kept glancing at her brother, like they were counting the same money in their heads. And in the corner, where servants were supposed to melt into shadows, there stood Grace, 16, too young to be in a war, too young to be anyone's target, but targets don't get a vote. She held a baby tight against her chest, 9 months old, light brown skin, gray eyes that didn't belong to her, eyes that matched the man in the coffin. That baby wasn't just a baby, that baby was leverage. The lawyer cleared his throat. One of those nervous little sounds men make when they know they're about to ruin somebody's life and still expect to go home for supper. He started reading, formal words first. Dry, safe. Everybody let themselves breathe through it, even Richard, especially Richard. He stopped listening because in his mind the ending was already written. Then the lawyer hit the part that mattered, and his voice changed, just a little but enough. To my son Richard. Richard's mouth tightened into a smile. There it is, he thought, crown me. I leave the sum of $5,000. That smile cracked. And my collection of books. Now his eyes went hard, with the understanding that he has proven himself unworthy of greater responsibility. You ever see a man get slapped without a hand touching him? That was Richard. The lawyer kept going, steady now, like he'd accepted the danger of the job. Gambling, drinking, rot. A list of sins read out loud in front of God and blood. Richard looked around like somebody had set him up, like there had to be a second page where the real fortune lived. Margaret didn't move, but her jaw worked. She was doing math too, just a different kind. The kind where the answer is always who to destroy. Then the lawyer turned to Catherine. A modest sum. Jewelry. A polite suggestion about marriage, like she was property being transferred in a nicer box. Catherine gasped, insulted. Not because her father was dead, because her cut was small. That right there told you everything about that room. Then the lawyer paused. This was the moment. He looked down at the paper again, like maybe the ink would change if he stared hard enough. But ink doesn't get scared, people do. He read the next sentence. The remainder of my estate, the plantation, the lands, the assets, are left in trust to my son, Thomas Edmund Blackwood, to be administered by his mother, Grace, until he reaches the age of 21. Let that sit with you. In a house full of white money and white pride, the name that took the throne was Richard. It was Catherine. It was Margaret. It was a baby in a black girl's arms. You could feel the air get heavier. Like the walls leaned in to listen. Margaret stood up so fast her chair hit the floor. She didn't even flinch at the sound. Her face went tight and bright with fury. No, she said. Simple word, no trembling, no bargaining. The way a boss says no when someone asks for what belongs to her. She pointed without pointing. Her eyes did it. That girl and that child cannot have this. She didn't say Grace's name. People like that don't use names when they're talking about things they plan to erase. Richard finally found his voice, and it came out like fire. That's not my brother, he said. That's a mistake. That's filth. The lawyer didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He was holding paper stronger than a pistol. It's not a mistake, he said. Colonel Blackwood filed documents. He freed Grace. He freed the child, legally, months ago. Margaret's lips curled, not at the law, at the audacity of the law touching her world. Then the lawyer reached into his satchel and pulled out another envelope, a second blade. "Your husband anticipated this," he said to Margaret, and you could hear it. He didn't like being in that room anymore. He opened the letter and began to read. The colonel's words weren't gentle, not to his family, not to his legacy. He didn't blame the baby. He blamed the ones who'd been living off him. He laid Richard out as a liability, a man too soft in discipline, too hard in appetite, a gambler, a drunk, a disgrace. He laid Catherine out too, all mirrors and whispers, a girl spending her life chasing approval from people who'd never bleed for her. And then he did something no man like him was supposed to do in that era. He praised Grace, not her looks, not her obedience, her mind, her dignity, her spine. That's what made Margaret's eyes sharpen, because a man can cheat, a man can wander. But when a man starts respecting the person you consider beneath you, that's not betrayal, that's a revolution. The letter ended with a final twist, cold and clean. The colonel left receipts, evidence, names, debts, private letters, hidden sins. A warning: fight this will in court and the whole town will learn what you really are. Catherine went pale, like her blood packed up and left. Richard's hands balled into fists so tight you could see the tendons twitching. Margaret smiled, not a happy smile, a planning smile. In that moment I knew what she was thinking, and I wasn't even in that room. Because women like Margaret don't argue with paper when paper wins. They argue with the world, they argue with bodies. Richard shoved his chair back so hard it scraped the floor like a threat. He stepped toward the corner, toward Grace. Grace tightened her hold on the baby. Her back hit the wall. She didn't scream. She didn't plead. She just watched them. Smart girls watch. Catherine started talking fast, nonsense words spilling out, the sound of panic trying to become a plan. The lawyer rose, trying to calm it down, but calm has no authority in a room where greed just got disrespected. Grace looked at that baby's face, those gray eyes staring back like they already knew the world was dangerous. And right then, inside that locked room, she understood the real inheritance. Not the money, not the land, the danger. Because the colonel was dead and the only shield she ever had got buried with him. And as Margaret's smile stayed on her mouth like a promise, Grace realized something else too. They weren't going to fight her in daylight. They were going to do it quiet. They were going to do it clean. And they were going to start the moment the lawyer left the property, because that's when nobody would be watching. The lawyer packed his papers like a man folding up a warning sign. He didn't say much on his way out. Didn't need to. His boots on that floor were the loudest thing in the room, because everybody was listening for the moment the law stopped being present. Grace didn't move until she heard the front door close. That's when the room changed. Margaret didn't yell. That surprised people, but I wasn't surprised. Folks think power is volume. It ain't. Real power is a whisper that makes grown men obey. She looked at Richard first, not like a mother, like a commander. Richard took one step toward Grace again, then stopped. He wanted to tear the baby out her arms. He wanted to scream his way back into the will. But even he knew, do it too loud, do it too soon, and you leave fingerprints. Margaret's eyes slid to Catherine. Catherine was shaking, but she wasn't innocent. Not even close. She'd been living two lives and thought nobody could see it. Now her father's dead letter had her secrets in a box, and she was realizing she could be controlled by anyone holding that box. Margaret spoke finally, soft. "Not here," she said. 2 words and it was settled. Grace turned to leave, slow, respectful, like she was still what they wanted her to be. She kept her head down because she understood the rule of dangerous rooms. You don't show your throat. She made it to the hallway before Richard's voice cut through. "You think you're walking out with my property?" Grace didn't turn around. She answered like she was speaking to weather. "I'm walking out with my son." That stung him more than any insult, because it made it sound simple, clean, natural, and nothing about this was natural to them. Grace got back to her cabin with the baby pressed close, her mind racing ahead of her feet. She wasn't thinking about feelings. She was thinking about angles. Where would they hit first? Not with a gun, not yet. They'd hit her name, they'd hit her character, they'd hit the paper that made her free. Freedom in that part of Georgia was a thin coat of paint, pretty until it rained. That night she didn't sleep. She sat with Thomas in her lap and listened. not just to the plantation, to the space between sounds. A horse shifting in the distance, a footstep that paused too long, the way the wind changed when somebody was near the door. She learned that kind of listening back when she was still considered property. You learn fast when your body belongs to somebody else. Just before dawn it happened, not a knock, a kick. The door flew open like the cabin didn't have a right to boundaries. Richard walked in first, two overseers behind him, rifles hanging loose but ready. The kind of men who needed permission to be cruel, and once they got it, they became artists. Richard didn't look at the baby, not really. He looked at Grace like she was a stain on the family name. "Up," he said. "Now." Grace rose with Thomas in her arms. No sudden moves, no pleading. She could feel the rifles in the room like extra hearts beating. "This is my home," she said quietly. Richard laughed like she'd told a joke. "Home," he repeated. "You got real comfortable, didn't you?" Grace held her ground. "The will." "The will ain't standing in this cabin," Richard snapped. "The lawyer ain't here. My father ain't here. It's just you and me, and what I decide is true." That's the moment you recognize the game. Paper doesn't protect you when men decide they're done pretending. He nodded to the overseers. "Take her." Porter, the older one, hesitated. He didn't like Richard, but he liked starving even less. He had that look poor men get when they're told to do rich men's dirt. "Mr. Richard," Porter muttered, "she got papers. Folks are talking if this comes back." Richard stepped close enough that Porter could smell him. "If you don't move," he said low, "you won't have this job by breakfast, and you'll be lucky if that's all you lose." Porter swallowed whatever courage he had left and reached for Grace's arm. Grace didn't fight. Fighting gets you killed quick when the other side has the guns and the law. She let them pull her outside, still holding Thomas, still steady, still breathing like she wasn't terrified. But inside she was counting exits. They dragged her across the yard as the sky started to light. Workers peered out from cabins, eyes wide, mouths shut, not because they didn't care, because caring out loud was dangerous too. At the main road they stopped. The other overseer shoved her forward and she hit the dirt hard, twisting her body to keep the baby from taking the fall. Thomas started crying, loud, angry, innocent. Richard stood over her like he was delivering a verdict. "Come back," he said, "and you'll be treated like a trespasser." Grace looked up at him, calm as stone. "This land is his," she said, nodding at Thomas. Richard's smile was thin. "Let the courts tell me that," he said, "if you live long enough to see them." Then he turned and walked away, leaving her in the road like she was trash somebody tossed out before sunrise. Grace sat there a second, holding that crying baby, dust on her dress, dawn breaking behind her like the world didn't care. And then she reached into the hidden pocket in her clothing and touched the folded papers. Her freedom. Thomas's freedom. Proof that on paper she was untouchable, but paper burns. She stood up and started walking toward town. No carriage. No escort. Just a teenage girl and an heir to a fortune, moving down a dirt road in Confederate Georgia. Every step she took, she could feel eyes on her from places she couldn't see. Because news travels fast when money changes hands, and somebody somewhere was already deciding how much her life was worth. By the time she reached the edge of town, she heard it. Her own name, whispered by strangers like it was a dirty secret. And that's when she realized the Blackwoods had already made their first move. They didn't just throw her out. They released her into a world they controlled. And if she didn't find a smarter kind of protection, that road was going to end with a body in a ditch, and a baby handed back to the people who wanted him erased. The lawyer's office smelled like ink, dust, and hesitation. Grace stepped inside with Thomas still crying against her chest, dirt on her dress, eyes sharp enough to cut through lies. She didn't ask for permission. People with nothing left don't wait to be invited. Edwin Hartley looked up and froze, not because he was surprised to see her, because he'd been expecting this, just not this fast. "They removed you," he said, not a question. "They dumped me," Grace replied, "like I never belonged." Hartley sighed and rubbed his face, the kind of sigh men make when theory meets blood. "I warned you," he said quietly. "This family doesn't lose well." Grace stepped closer, close enough that he could see the baby's face, close enough that ignoring her would feel personal. "You read that will," she said. "You said it was law." "It is," Hartley said. "On paper." Grace leaned in. "Then why am I standing here homeless?" Hartley didn't answer right away. He closed the door to his office, slow, careful, like the walls might be listening. "Because," he said, lowering his voice, "there's a difference between what the law allows and what powerful people will tolerate." Grace absorbed that, not with fear, with calculation. "So tell me," she said, "what are my moves?" Hartley studied her for a long moment. He'd represented men with money, men with names, men who could afford patience. Grace had none of that, but she had something else. She was calm, and calm in a storm scares people. "You have 3 paths," he said finally. "Say them." "First," he said, "you disappear, take the child north, start over. Forget the plantation ever existed." Grace shook her head immediately. "No." Hartley nodded. He expected that. "Second," he continued, "you negotiate, accept a settlement. They'll give you a sum big enough to silence you. You live comfortably, they keep the land." Grace didn't answer right away. "Who works that land?" she asked. Hartley blinked. "The labor force." "Don't dress it up," Grace said. "The people." Hartley hesitated. "Richard would take control," he said, "which means, yes, it would get ugly." Grace's jaw tightened. "No." Hartley exhaled slowly. "Then there's the third path," he said. "We fight." Silence filled the room, heavy, dangerous. "You file an emergency petition," he continued. "You claim your standing as the child's legal guardian and administrator of the estate. You force the court to acknowledge the will." And Grace asked, and Hartley said carefully, "You become the most hated person in this county." Grace almost smiled. "What are my chances?" Hartley didn't lie. "In theory, strong. In practice, you're a young black woman challenging one of the most powerful white families in Georgia. Judges have friends, juries have prejudices." "So I lose?" "Not necessarily," Hartley said, "but they'll try to break you before you ever reach a verdict." Grace looked down at Thomas. He stopped crying, just stared up at her like he trusted her to see what he couldn't. "When do we file?" she asked. Hartley paused. "Today," he said, "if you want any protection at all." "Then do it." Hartley nodded, already reaching for paper. But before he could write a word, he stopped. "One more thing," he said. "You can't stay alone, not now." "Where do I go?" "There's a freedmen's camp outside town," he said. "Not safe, but safer than the road." Grace adjusted Thomas in her arms. "I've slept in worse." Hartley hesitated again. "They'll smear you," he said. "They'll say you manipulated him. They'll say the child isn't his. They'll say you're unfit." Grace's voice stayed steady. "Let them talk." Hartley looked at her like he was seeing something new. "You understand," he said slowly. "This isn't just a lawsuit anymore." Grace met his eyes. "I know," she said. "This is a takeover attempt." Hartley swallowed. "I'll file," he said, "but once this starts, it doesn't stop." Grace turned toward the door. "Good," she said. "Because neither do they." Outside, the town buzzed with rumors already forming teeth. A girl who knew too much. A baby who owned too much. A family that had never been told no. As Grace stepped back into the street, she felt it again. That pressure. That sense that unseen hands were already moving pieces she couldn't see yet. Because when money gets embarrassed, it doesn't retreat. It hires patience. And somewhere behind those plantation walls, Margaret Blackwood was already deciding that if the court wouldn't erase Grace, something else would. The camp sat at the edge of town like a question nobody wanted to answer. Tents stitched together from scraps, smoke curling low, people moving quiet, eyes always checking who was watching. Freedom had brought them here, but it hadn't brought safety, just space. Grace walked in carrying Thomas like she belonged there, not proud, not ashamed, just alert. They were already whispering, not her name, her story. Stories move faster than truth, especially when white money is involved. By the time she reached the center of the camp, she could feel the weight of it pressing in from every direction. A tall, older man stepped forward, gray beard, straight back, eyes that had survived worse than gossip. "You the girl," he said, calm, not accusing, measuring. Grace met his gaze. "I'm Grace." He nodded once. "Name S. Moses," he said. "Folks call me Reverend when they want advice they don't plan to follow." A few low laughs rippled behind him, nervous ones. He glanced at the baby. "That's the boy." Grace nodded. Moses stepped aside. "Come," he said, "before somebody decides you shouldn't be here." He led her through the camp, past faces that studied her like she was both miracle and mistake. Some eyes were kind, some were sharp, some carried resentment she couldn't blame. Inside a low tent, an older woman stirred a pot over a fire, strong hands, tired eyes. She looked up once and understood everything without being told. "You hungry?" the woman asked. Grace nodded before she could stop herself. The woman handed her a bowl like it was a transaction, not charity. "Eat," she said, "then talk." Grace ate slow. Thomas slept. For the first time since dawn, her shoulders dropped a fraction. When the bowl was empty, the woman sat across from her. "They saying things," the woman said, "about you." Grace didn't flinch. "I know. They saying you planned this, that you played him." Grace swallowed. "They always say that." The woman leaned in. "You know what they'll really try?" Grace looked up. "They'll try to make you disappear," the woman said. "Quiet, clean, no body, no story." Moses nodded from the doorway. "They already pushed you off the land," he said. "Next step is pushing you out the way." Grace exhaled slowly. "Then I need witnesses," she said. "People who saw how he treated me. People who know whose child this is." Moses smiled, thin. "You already thinking like a general." "I don't have the luxury of thinking like a victim." That night Grace didn't sleep much. Not because the camp was loud. Because it was too quiet. She kept replaying Richard's eyes. The way they looked past her like she was temporary, like he was waiting for permission. Just before morning, a boy ran into the camp, breathless. "They coming," he said. "White men, asking questions." Moses stood immediately. "How many?" "Two," the boy said, well-dressed. Grace felt it click into place. Not Richard, Margaret. This wasn't a threat, it was reconnaissance. Grace stood, adjusted Thomas, and straightened her dress. "Tell them," she said, "I'll speak in public, not private." Moses studied her. "You sure?" "They want me scared," Grace said. "I won't give them that." The men arrived minutes later. Polite, smiling, asking after her health, expressing concern. Margaret's voice was in their mouths even if she wasn't there. One of them leaned closer. "You don't look well," he said. "This is no place for a young woman and a child." Grace met his eyes. "Neither is a grave." The smile faltered. "We're authorized to offer you a solution," the other man said. "A generous one." Grace shook her head. "I don't negotiate my son's future in tents," she said, "or threats." They left soon after, but not before Grace noticed something important. They weren't angry. They were confident. That's when she knew. This wasn't the main move. It was the setup. Because people like the Blackwoods never strike first. They let the town do it for them. And as the sun rose over the camp, Grace realized the danger wasn't coming from one direction anymore. It was coming from everywhere she might turn. The courthouse didn't belong to justice. It belonged to memory. Every step inside that building reminded you who had always won. Portraits on the walls, names carved into wood, men who'd never had to ask permission for anything. Grace felt all of it the moment she crossed the threshold. Eyes turned, whispers followed, some curious, some offended, some already convinced she was lying. She took her seat with Thomas in her arms like armor, not hiding him, not offering him up, letting them see exactly who this fight was for. Across the room sat the Blackwoods. Margaret, dressed like mourning, was a uniform, perfect posture, perfect control. The kind of woman who didn't raise her voice because she'd never had to. Richard leaned back, jaw tight, hatred simmering under his skin. He looked at Grace the way men look at problems they intend to solve permanently. Catherine kept her gaze forward, silent, afraid. She learned something since the will was read. Fear travels downhill. The judge entered. Older man, plantation man. You could tell by the way he looked at Grace before she even spoke. This hearing concerns the administration of the Blackwood estate, he said. State your name. Grace stood. Grace Blackwood. That caused a stir. The judge's brow furrowed. You claim that name. I was married, Grace said, before my son was born. Margaret's lawyer rose instantly. There is no public record of such a marriage. Hartley stood calmly. There is a document, he said, signed, witnessed. Lawful. The judge accepted it like it offended him. He read slowly, carefully, like he was searching for an excuse. And you claim this child, he said, gesturing toward Thomas, is Colonel Blackwood S. Yes, Grace said. Margaret's lawyer smiled thin. Your Honor, he said, we question whether this young woman is fit to manage an estate of such size. Grace waited. They always start there. Unfit, improper, unnatural. She is young, the lawyer continued. Uneducated, of questionable character. Grace's hands tightened slightly. Hartley stepped forward. Colonel Blackwood himself described her intelligence as exceptional, he said. He entrusted her with the estate precisely because of her competence. Richard couldn't stay quiet. She got into his head, he snapped. That's all this is, a girl manipulating an old man. The judge raised a hand. Enough. Grace finally spoke again. May I speak, Your Honor? The judge hesitated, then nodded. Grace didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She told the truth like it was a ledger. She spoke of the books she kept, the accounts she learned, the nights she spent listening instead of sleeping. She spoke of the child's birth, of the documents signed, of the orders she followed. She never said love. She never said romance. She said responsibility. That made the room uncomfortable. The judge called a recess. Margaret stood as they exited. She passed Grace close enough to whisper. You can win this hearing, she said softly. You won't survive the year. Grace met her eyes. You'd be surprised, she said. The judge returned. His ruling was careful, political. The will stood for now. But administration would remain with Margaret until a final decision. Grace was ordered off the property. Again, the crowd murmured, some disappointed, some satisfied. Hartley leaned in. This isn't over, he whispered. We appeal. Grace nodded. She already knew. As she left the courthouse, she felt it again, that pressure, that shift. The Blackwoods hadn't won, but they hadn't lost either, and people like them don't wait for permission to finish what they start. As Grace stepped back into the street, she noticed a man across the way, white, watching too closely, not with curiosity, with interest. That was new. And new interest in a war like this usually meant one thing. Another player had just entered the game. That man across the street didn't move when everyone else did, didn't whisper, didn't avert his eyes, didn't pretend this was just entertainment. He watched Grace like he was reading stock prices. Grace felt it immediately. The way you feel eyes on your back before the danger introduces itself. He waited until she reached the edge of the crowd. Then he spoke. Miss Grace. Not girl. Not hey. Not fear in his voice. That told her everything. She turned slowly. He was mid-30s, clean coat, northern cut. Hands too soft for field work, too steady for panic. This was a man who chose his risks carefully. My name is Thornton, he said. Jacob Thornton. She didn't offer hers. Power never rushes to introduce itself. I've been following your case, he continued, from Savannah. Grace narrowed her eyes. That's a long way to travel for curiosity. He smiled. I don't run on curiosity, I run on outcomes. That was the right answer. They walked, not together, parallel, like two people who didn't want to be seen conspiring. You know what today's ruling really means, Thornton said. Grace didn't look at him. It means they're buying time. Yes, he said, and time favors people with money, friends, and patience. Grace stopped walking, and you? Thornton stopped too. I represent people who understand leverage. Now Grace looked at him. You're not from here, she said. No, he agreed, and that's why I can say this without flinching. He leaned in slightly. They're not trying to beat you in court anymore. Grace's jaw set. They're trying to break me. Thornton nodded. Socially, economically, physically, if they can make it look accidental. Grace exhaled once. I already knew that. Good, he said, because most people don't realize they're in a war until the first body drops. Grace adjusted Thomas in her arms. What do you want? Thornton didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat and handed her a folded paper. Names, contacts, banks, newspapers. Allies, he said, and witnesses, people who don't owe the Blackwoods anything. Grace scanned it quickly. This makes my life louder, she said. Yes, Thornton replied, and louder lives are harder to erase. Grace folded the paper and tucked it away. And the cost? Thornton met her eyes. If you win, your case becomes precedent. If you lose, it becomes a warning. Grace studied him. So you're not helping me. Thornton smiled. I'm investing. They parted ways without shaking hands. That night the camp felt different. Too many shadows, too many questions, too many people suddenly interested in where Grace slept. Moses noticed too. They spreading talk, he said quietly, saying you cursed, saying bad luck follows you. Grace didn't react. They don't need people to hate me, she said, just need them scared to stand near me. Near midnight, a rock hit the side of her shelter, then another, then a voice from the dark. Go north while you still breathing. Grace didn't answer, she waited. Because threats shouted into the dark are never the real ones. The real ones come quiet. Just before dawn, Moses returned, face tight. They burned something, he said. Grace stood. What? Your name, he replied. On the road in pitch. Grace closed her eyes once, marking territory. She looked down at Thomas, sleeping peacefully, unaware that men were already deciding how to shape his future without him. Grace knew then what the next phase was. This wasn't just about holding ground. It was about taking it. Because if she stayed on defense, they'd bleed her slow. And if there's one thing Grace had learned from watching powerful men her whole life, it was this. The only way to survive a war like this is to make your enemy react. And somewhere not far from that camp, someone was already planning how to make her disappear before she learned how to strike back. The fire didn't take much, just a sign, just her name, burned into the dirt like a warning nobody bothered to hide. Grace stood over it at sunrise, Thomas wrapped tight against her chest, smoke still hanging low like a bad memory. Folks gathered around but kept their distance. Fear spreads faster than flames. This was the message. You are seen. You are marked. Leave. Moses watched the road while Grace watched the people. Some faces she recognized, some she didn't. A few looked guilty, most looked scared. That told her more than any confession could. They want you gone without touching you, Moses said quietly. Make the ground too hot to stand on. Grace nodded. They think I'll run. And if you don't? She looked up at him. Then they escalate. That same morning, the escalation began. The camp's food deliveries slowed. A merchant who'd sold on credit suddenly remembered old debts. Another claimed his wagon broke an axle. Excuses stacked up like sandbags. By afternoon, a rumor reached Grace through 3 different mouths, each version uglier than the last. She'd depoisoned the colonel. She'd practiced witchcraft. She planned to turn the plantation into a haven for runaway slaves and criminals. The goal wasn't belief. It was isolation. Thornton's list came out of Grace's pocket that night. She didn't contact everyone. That would look desperate. She chose 3. A newspaper man who liked scandals with teeth. A banker whose loyalty followed opportunity, not skin. And a union officer stationed close enough to matter. She wrote carefully, calm, precise. No begging, just facts, dates, threats, names. When you speak like that, people listen. 2 days later, the newspaper man arrived. He didn't come to the camp, too dangerous for his reputation. They met in a back room of a dry goods store. You understand, he said, that once I print this, there's no turning back. Grace met his eyes. I turned back the day they threw me off my own land. He smiled thin and started writing. By the end of the week, her name wasn't just whispered anymore. It was printed. And that changed the tone of the threats. Now they weren't anonymous. Now they were personal. A note slipped under her bedding one night. "You won't make it to court again." Another followed. "Accidents happen to women who forget their place." Grace burned them both and slept anyway, because fear is a tool, and she was done letting it be used on her. Hartley sent word soon after. The appeal was moving faster than expected. Too fast, which meant the Blackwoods were nervous, and nervous people make mistakes. Grace packed what little she had, not to run, to move closer. She relocated to a small house near town, closer to witnesses, closer to eyes that mattered. Moses disapproved. Thornton approved. "Visibility," Thornton said when he heard. "Smart." That same night, someone tested her resolve. Footsteps outside. Late, careful. Grace didn't call out, she waited. The door handle turned, slow, then stopped. A pause, a breath. Grace raised the pistol Thornton had insisted she carry. "Wrong house," she said into the dark. Calm, clear, silence. Then retreating steps she didn't chase. Men who retreat once will return with company. The next morning the Union officer replied protection would be limited, but attention, that could be arranged. Grace smiled for the first time in weeks. Attention was dangerous, but so was being invisible. As the appeal date approached, tension tightened like wire. Margaret Blackwood hadn't made a public move in days. That worried Grace more than threats ever could. Because women like Margaret don't burn their enemies. They let them hang. And Grace knew, deep down, the next move wouldn't come from the courtroom. It would come from the plantation. From land still full of people being worked too hard by a man with too much rage. Richard. And when men like him feel cornered, they don't strike where you're strong. They strike where you care the most. Grace looked down at Thomas, then toward the distant field she could almost see in her mind. Whatever Richard was planning, it was already in motion. Grace felt it before she heard it, that low, crawling dread, the kind that doesn't scream, the kind that sits in your chest and waits. The report came in pieces, never all at once. That's how bad news travels when people are afraid to own it. First, a field hand slipped into town after dark, shoes torn, back split, wouldn't look her in the eye, then another, then another. By the third story, Grace didn't need details anymore. She knew the pattern. Richard had taken control like a man punishing the land for embarrassing him. Workdays stretched longer. Food got thinner. Whips came out of storage like they'd been waiting for permission. Men were beaten not for mistakes but for reminders. Reminders of who really owned what. Grace sat at the small table in her rented house, listening, taking it in, calm on the surface. Inside, something hardened. Richard wasn't just running the plantation. He was poisoning it. And that poison was meant for her. Because if he could break the people, turn them desperate, angry, scared, he could make her look like the cause. See, she imagined him saying, "This is what happens when you challenge order." Thornton arrived the next morning, face tight. "He's daring you," he said. "He wants you to move before the appeal lands." Grace nodded. "If I move too early," she said, "I look reckless." "And if you don't?" She finished the thought. "He kills morale, then blames me." Thornton leaned back. "Either way, he's forcing the clock." Grace stood and went to the window, looked out at the street. Ordinary people moving through ordinary lives, unaware that land and blood were being negotiated just outside their vision. "I need proof," she said. "Not stories, not rumors." Thornton hesitated. "You know what that means?" "Yes," Grace said. "It means I go back." Thornton shook his head immediately. "That's exactly what they want." Grace turned. "They want me scared," she said. "They don't want me seen." Moses said the same thing when she told him. Anger and worry mixing in his voice. "You step foot near that place and they'll say you trespassed," he warned. "Or worse." Grace answered softly, "Then I won't go as the owner." That night she dressed plain, covered her hair, left Thomas with Esther and Moses, her heart tight but her face steady. "I'll be back before morning," she said. Moses didn't argue, he just nodded, because some fights can't be delegated. Grace approached the plantation from the side road where the fields met the trees. She knew the land better than Richard ever would. She de-learned it barefoot, counting steps, memorizing sounds. She heard the whip before she saw anything. Sharp. Wet, final, a man cried out. Then bit it back. Grace stayed low, counted guards, counted shadows. She saw it all. An overseer drunk on borrowed authority. Richard watching from the porch, rifle in hand, not firing it, just holding it like a threat that didn't need to speak. Grace's jaw locked. This wasn't punishment, this was theater for her. She slipped closer, heart steady, mind sharp, committing everything to memory. Faces, names, patterns. Then she heard her name, not spoken, mocked. One of the overseers laughed. "She thinks she owned this place," he said. "Girl don't know her war already lost." Richard chuckled, low, satisfied. That was the moment Grace almost made a mistake, almost stepped out, almost turned evidence into blood, but she didn't. Because Bumpy Johnson-type power doesn't strike first. It waits. Grace backed away into the dark just as footsteps crunched nearby. A guard moving off pattern, she held her breath. The man stopped, looked around, close enough she could smell tobacco. Then a voice called him back. Grace slipped away unseen. By dawn, she was back in town, dirt on her shoes, fire in her chest, clarity in her eyes. Now she had what she needed, proof, witnesses, and a reason to move fast. But as the appeal date drew closer, Grace understood something else too. Richard wasn't just brutal, he was impatient. And impatient men, when they realize they're losing control, don't tighten the leash, they cut it. Which meant the next move wouldn't be symbolic, it would be final. And Grace knew with cold certainty that before the court could rule, Richard Blackwood was going to try to end this his own way. The appeal date hit the town before sunrise like a rumor with teeth. Grace woke up already dressed, already ready, no nerves, just focus. The kind you get when you know the next move decides who stays breathing. Hartley met her outside the courthouse. His face told her enough. "They're cornered," he said, "which makes them unpredictable." Grace nodded. "I've been unpredictable my whole life," she replied. "They're just late to the lesson." Inside, the courtroom felt different this time. Quieter, heavier, too many outsiders, too many eyes that didn't belong to the Blackwoods. Margaret sat rigid, hands folded, lips pressed tight, not angry, calculating. Richard wasn't there. That bothered Grace more than if he had been. The judges read the findings slow, careful, like men who knew the world was watching. Original will, valid, administration rights, restored, immediate transfer of control. Grace felt it land in her chest, not relief, not joy, control. Margaret didn't react, not yet, but Grace caught it, the smallest shift in her posture, the acceptance of a woman who'd already planned for this outcome. Outside, Thornton was waiting. "You won," he said. Grace shook her head. "I survived a round." A union escort was arranged. Not protection, supervision. Enough eyes to make the handover official. Not enough to stop something ugly if it moved fast. The carriage rolled toward the plantation under a low sky. Grace watched the fields come back into view, familiar, heavy, alive with memory. As they approached the main house, Grace saw them. Too many men. Not workers, not guards, strangers, armed, spread loose like they'd been waiting. Richard stood on the porch, no rifle this time, just a smile that didn't belong to victory or defeat. Margaret was nowhere in sight. The union officer beside Grace frowned. "This isn't standard," he muttered. Grace stepped down from the carriage before he could stop her. Richard raised his hand slightly. "Welcome home," he said. "We need to talk." Grace didn't move closer. "Move aside," she said. "This is over." Richard laughed softly. "You really think paper ends things like this?" One of the men behind him shifted. Another spit in the dirt. Grace felt it then. The same feeling she'd had the night her cabin door was kicked in. This wasn't a standoff. It was a delay. From the tree line behind the house, a shot cracked the air. Not close, not far. A signal. The armed men moved. The union officer shouted orders. Richard's smile vanished. Grace's heart dropped as she realized the truth too late. Richard wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to stall, because whatever was coming next wasn't aimed at her. And somewhere on that land, something she cared about more than ownership, more than money, more than victory, was already in danger. Grace moved before panic could catch up. Not toward Richard, past him. Straight off the porch and into the yard, eyes scanning fast, counting men, counting gaps. The Union officer was shouting now, orders colliding with confusion, but Grace wasn't listening to any of it, because she finally saw the real play. This wasn't about stopping her from taking the house. This was about drawing her eyes away from something else. Another shot cracked, closer this time, not aimed at the porch. A scream followed, short, cut off. Grace felt her chest tighten like a fist closed around her lungs. "The quarters," she said aloud, already moving. "They went to the quarters." Richard shouted after her, voice sharp with something close to panic. "Grace, stop." That told her everything. If this had been about killing her, he wouldn't be calling her back. She ran, not like a woman, not like a mother, like someone who understood terrain and timing. She cut across the yard, skirted the barn, stayed low where the land dipped. Years of watching had taught her where sound carried and where it died. Smoke rose ahead, thin. New, by the time she reached the first row of cabins, the scene was chaos. Men she didn't recognize were dragging people out, shoving them, shouting lies loud enough to become truth. Orders from the owner. "Get out, all of you." One cabin was already burning, not fully, just enough. A warning fire. Grace stepped into the open. "Stop," she said, not screamed, spoken. It cut through the noise like a blade. A few heads turned. Surprise flickered. Then anger. One of the men sneered. "Look at that," he said. "Queen finally showed up." Grace didn't answer him. She looked at the people instead. Faces she knew. Faces that had worked this land since before she could read. "This is illegal," she said. "Every one of you knows it." A man stepped closer, bigger than the rest, confidence borrowed from chaos. "And who's gonna stop us?" Grace met his eyes. "Me," she said. He laughed. Behind him, another man struck a worker with the butt of his rifle hard, too hard. That was the mistake. Grace raised her pistol and fired once into the dirt between them. The sound snapped the moment in half. "Next one won't miss," she said, calm, dead serious. For a second, nobody moved. Then boots thundered behind her. Zaya, then two more, then five workers, armed, not with rifles at first, tools, clubs, whatever they could grab. Not organized, but united. The men hesitated now. This wasn't what they'd been promised. This wasn't helpless people. Smoke drifted thicker. From the edge of the cabins, someone shouted Grace's name. Not fear, trust. Grace felt it settle on her shoulders like weight and armor at the same time. And then she heard it, hooves, fast, too many, from the far road. Grace turned just as Richard emerged between buildings, breathless now, face twisted with something raw. "You should have stayed on the porch," he said. Grace stared at him. "You set this up," she said. "You wanted blood." Richard smiled, wild and proud. "I wanted it finished." The first riders burst into view, armed men, more than before, spilling onto the land like a tide that didn't care who it drowned. Grace looked at the people behind her. The workers, the families, the children pressed into doorways. She understood the truth with perfect clarity. The court had given her control. But this was going to decide whether she could keep it. And as the riders closed in and smoke climbed into the sky, Grace realized the next few minutes weren't about law anymore. They were about whether power could be taken. Or only survived. And someone, somewhere in this mess of fire and footsteps, was going to make a move that couldn't be undone. Grace didn't shout, didn't panic. She raised her hand, slow, deliberate, and the people behind her went quiet. That's when you know leadership is real, when noise listens. The riders pulled up hard, dust and heat and bad intention all tangled together. 15 men, maybe more, poor whites with borrowed guns and rented courage. The kind that comes cheap and spends fast. Richard stepped forward like a man introducing his solution. "You see," he said, spreading his hands, "this is what happens when order breaks." Grace looked past him, not at him. She was reading the board. The riders weren't soldiers. They were muscle, temporary, loud, which meant the real danger wasn't in front of her. It was still coming. The Union officer finally forced his way through the confusion, pistol drawn, voice carrying authority that used to mean something around here. "This land is under federal protection," he shouted. "Stand down." A few men hesitated, most didn't, because Richard had already paid them in promises, and men like that don't stop for words once they smell permission. One of the riders fired into the air. Another fired low, too low. A body dropped behind Grace. Not dead, not yet, but bleeding enough to make the moment real. That's when Grace moved, not toward the guns, toward Richard. She crossed the distance fast, eyes locked on his, voice steady like this was a business meeting gone sour. "You lose control now," she said, "and you never get it back." Richard laughed, wild again. "You think you still have leverage?" Grace leaned in just enough that only he could hear her. "I saw what you did last night," she said. "The beatings, the fires. I have witnesses who won't disappear." Richard's smile twitched. "You don't have time," he snapped. Grace smiled back just a little. "Neither do you." From the road, another sound cut through the chaos. Not hooves, wheels heavy, metal, Union wagons moving fast. Thornton had kept his word. The riders noticed too late. Some backed off, some cursed, some realized they'd been sold a lie. Richard turned, eyes darting, calculating his exit. Grace straightened and raised her voice. "Anyone who leaves now," she said, "leaves alive." That mattered. Men like this always listen when survival enters the room. One by one, guns lowered. Riders peeled off, not brave enough to face soldiers, not loyal enough to die for Richard Blackwood. Within minutes the yard cleared, smoke still rose, blood still stained the dirt, but the tide had shifted. Richard stood alone now, breathing hard, cornered. "This isn't over," he said like a prayer he needed to believe. Grace met his eyes. "It never is," she replied. Union soldiers moved in, weapons trained. The officer grabbed Richard's arm. "You're coming with us." What? Richard didn't fight. He just stared at Grace as they dragged him away, not with rage, with promise. That night fires were put out. The wounded were tended. The land went quiet again, but it wasn't peaceful. Grace stood on the porch as darkness settled, Thomas asleep against her shoulder. She had the house. She had the land. She had the people. But power like this doesn't come without interest. From the edge of the property, a figure watched. Not a rider, not a soldier. Someone who hadn't acted yet. Grace felt it, the same way she always had, because Richard was only the loud threat. The quiet ones. They wait longer, and somewhere in that waiting, a new danger was already deciding how to collect what it believed was still owed. The night after the raid didn't bring sleep. It brought inventory. Grace walked the land by lantern light, counting damage the way other people count bodies. Burned cabins, broken doors, blood soaked into dirt that had already taken too much from too many. She didn't cry, she filed it away. Because crying is for when the danger's gone, and the danger was still breathing. Union soldiers stayed through dawn, not out of loyalty, out of paperwork. By noon, most of them would be gone, pulled back to somewhere louder, somewhere that mattered more to men in uniforms. Grace knew that too. Thornton joined her on the porch just before sunrise. He looked tired now, the kind of tired that comes from realizing you backed the right side in the wrong fight. "You won today," he said. Grace didn't answer right away. "No," she said finally. "I stopped a takeover." Thornton frowned. "That's not the same thing," she continued. "Winning means they stop coming." Thornton followed her gaze across the fields. "They won't," he said quietly. "Not after this." Grace nodded. "That's what worries me." Richard was removed before noon. Shackled, silent, not defiant anymore. Dangerous men don't rage when they lose, they remember. Margaret never came out of the house, not once. By afternoon the soldiers left, just like Grace knew they would. The plantation exhaled and then held its breath again. Workers gathered near the quarters, unsure what came next. Grace stood in front of them, soot on her dress, eyes steady. "This land is yours to walk without fear," she said. "Anyone who threatens that answers to me." No cheering, just nods. That was better. That evening Hartley arrived with papers and warnings. "Legally," he said, "you're secure. Practically," he trailed off. "I know," Grace said. "You've humiliated a powerful family," he continued. "And you've done it publicly." Grace looked toward the road. "They humiliated themselves," she said. "I just didn't stop them." Hartley hesitated. "There's talk," he said. "Not about courts, about other organizations, men who don't wear uniforms, men who don't answer to judges." Grace's jaw tightened. "Say it," she said. "Night Riders," Hartley whispered. "They're forming again, different names, same habits." Grace closed her eyes for a moment. She'd known it was coming. Power never forgives being challenged by someone it doesn't respect. That night, as the plantation settled into uneasy quiet, Grace sat at her desk and wrote letters. Not pleas, warnings. She listed names, dates, actions, and she sealed copies, because if anything happened to her, the truth would not die with her. Near midnight, Esther came running. "There's someone at the edge of the property," she said. "Not hiding, just standing there." Grace stood slowly and picked up her coat. She walked alone to the fence line. A man waited there, hooded, mounted, still. He didn't speak, didn't threaten. He lifted one hand and dropped something into the dirt between them, a white ribbon, clean, deliberate. Then he turned his horse and disappeared into the trees. Grace stared at the ribbon long after the sound of hooves faded. She knew the message. This wasn't retaliation. This was a notice. The war wasn't over, it had just changed uniforms. And the next move wouldn't come with guns blazing or fires in the night. It would come quiet, patient, and aimed straight at the thing Grace valued more than land, more than power, more than victory, her future. Grace didn't pick up the ribbon right away. You don't touch messages like that until you understand who sent them and who else is watching. The dirt around it was clean. No footprints. No panic. Whoever rode in wanted her to know this wasn't rushed. This wasn't emotional. This was organized. She finally bent down, lifted the ribbon between two fingers and let it hang. White, pure. The kind of symbol men use when they believe they're righteous. Grace walked back to the house without looking over her shoulder. Fear gives people satisfaction. She denied them that. Inside, the plantation felt different now. Not loud, not violent, alert. Isaiah was waiting near the doorway, rifle resting against the wall. "You see it too?" he asked. Grace nodded. "They've moved past Richard." Isaiah frowned. "Then who's left?" Grace didn't answer immediately. "Men who don't want the land," she said finally. "They want the idea of me gone." That night the guards doubled. Fires stayed lit. Dogs were brought closer to the house. Grace didn't issue orders loudly. She didn't need to. Everyone felt the shift. Power had changed hands, but legitimacy hadn't settled yet. And legitimacy is what killers wait for. Near dawn, a rider arrived from town. Union insignia, nervous. He brought news wrapped in formality. Richard Blackwood had been released, not acquitted, not forgiven, released. Paperwork, jurisdiction, technicalities. Grace didn't react. "Where is he?" she asked. The rider swallowed. "No one knows, ma'am." Grace turned away. That was worse than any answer. Thornton arrived by noon, face drawn tight. "I tried to delay it," he said. "Pressure came from above." Grace nodded. "Pressure always does." "They'll say it wasn't political," he added. "They'll say it was procedure." Grace looked him dead in the eye. "It's always procedure when the right people are protected." That afternoon, 2 workers didn't return from town. By evening, a third was missing. No witnesses, no noise, just absence. Grace stood on the porch as the sun fell, counting lanterns across the property, 3 dark spaces. Isaiah joined her again. "This ain't about scaring us," he said quietly. Grace nodded. "It's about thinning us." She went inside and unlocked the desk drawer she hadn't opened since the appeal. Inside were names. Men who funded violence quietly. Men who never showed up. Men who stayed clean while others got bloody. Grace had been building this list since the first threat, since the first whisper. She knew now she wouldn't be able to protect everyone forever, so she'd have to choose, not who to save, but who to expose. As night settled in, a single shot echoed from far beyond the fields, not close enough to react to. Not far enough to ignore. Grace closed her eyes once. The message was clear. They weren't rushing her. They were pacing her. And somewhere out there, moving slow and deliberate, was someone who understood exactly how much patience this kind of war required, and was willing to take as long as it needed to finish her. Grace stopped counting the missing after the 3rd name, not because she didn't care, because counting starts to feel like permission when the numbers keep climbing. She called everyone in before nightfall. No trips to town, no lone walks, no exceptions. The plantation tightened in on itself like a fist. Some people didn't like it. Freedom, once tasted, doesn't like fences, even protective ones. Grace understood that too. But survival comes before comfort. Isaiah brought word just after dusk. "They found one," he said, "down by the creek." What? Grace didn't ask how bad. Isaiah's face answered it. They walked together, lanterns low. The body lay where the trees thinned out, placed carefully like it was meant to be discovered by the right eyes. No robbery, no struggle, just a message written in silence. Grace knelt, closed the man's eyes, and stood back up without a sound. "This wasn't random," Isaiah said. "No," Grace replied. "It was instructional." Back at the house, Thornton was waiting. He'd heard already. "News like that outruns horses." "This is escalating," he said. "You need federal protection, permanent." Grace shook her head. "They won't stay," she said, "and when they leave, it'll be worse." Thornton ran a hand through his hair. "Then what's the move?" Grace walked to the window and looked out at the land. At the cabins, at the people who had trusted her with their lives by staying. "I stop reacting," she said. Thornton turned. "You go on a fence." Grace nodded. "They think I'm protecting property," she continued. "They don't understand I'm protecting narrative." She pulled out the list again. Names circled now. "Men like this don't mind killing in the dark," she said, "but they panic when light gets involved." Thornton's eyes narrowed. "You're talking about exposure." "I'm talking about leverage," Grace corrected. "Exposure is just how you apply it." That night letters went out again. This time not to newspapers, to churches, to northern investors, to men whose reputations mattered more than their courage. Grace named names, not accusations, patterns. "If anything happens to me," she wrote, "start here." Near midnight, Esther came to the door, pale. "There's a rider again," she whispered. "Same place." Grace didn't hesitate this time. She walked straight to the fence line. The rider waited, posture relaxed, confident. Grace stopped 10 feet away. "You're early," she said. The man laughed softly from beneath his hood. "Things move faster when people get scared." Grace held his gaze. "Tell whoever sent you," she said, "that I've already started." The rider tilted his head. "Started what?" Grace smiled just enough, counting backwards. The rider's laugh died. He turned his horse, but before he left, he spoke over his shoulder. "You think this ends with you," he said. "This land will bury more than one name before it's done." What? Grace didn't answer. She watched him disappear into the trees, already memorizing the sound of his horse. Because now she knew something important. They weren't trying to scare her into leaving anymore. They were trying to scare her into striking first. And the next time they came, it wouldn't be to send a message. It would be to collect one. Grace slept 2 hours that night, not because she was tired, because discipline matters when fear wants control. She woke before dawn and dressed in silence. No lantern, no announcement. Power doesn't broadcast its movements once the enemy starts listening. By sunrise, 3 things had changed. First, the letters she'd sent began to work their way through the world. Not loudly, quietly. Ministers asking questions, bankers hesitating. Men who funded shadows suddenly checking over their shoulders. Second, the plantation stopped feeling hunted. It started feeling watched. That difference matters. Third, Richard Blackwood made his move, not with guns, with words. By mid-morning, a visitor arrived under the flag of politeness. White gloves, clean boots. A man who never dirtied his hands but knew exactly how to pay others to do it. He introduced himself as a mediator. Grace let him talk. He spoke about peace, stability, the dangers of unrest. He spoke about how violence benefits no one, how compromise was the grown man's solution. Then he slid a folded paper across the table, an offer, money enough to disappear, protection enough to stay gone. Grace didn't touch it. "Who sent you?" she asked. The man smiled. "People who want this to end." Grace leaned back. "So do I." He hesitated just a beat. "That land is cursed," he said. "Too much blood in it, too much change. Some things aren't meant to last." Grace met his eyes. "Funny," she said. "That's exactly what they used to say about us." The man stood, mask slipping just enough to show irritation. "Think carefully," he warned. "You're holding something a lot of people want buried." Grace nodded. "I know." He left without shaking her hand. By afternoon, one of the missing workers returned, barely standing, alive on purpose. They brought him to the house. Grace dismissed everyone else and sat across from him, listening while he forced the words out. Hoods. Names he didn't recognize. One voice he did. Richard, not leading, approving. Grace closed her eyes when she heard that part. Not because it hurt, because it confirmed. When the man finished, Grace stood and walked to the desk. She opened a drawer she hadn't planned to open yet. Inside was the final folder. The one she'd hoped she wouldn't need. Names, dates, routes, proof of money moving where it wasn't supposed to. She realized then what the real endgame was. Richard wasn't trying to win the land. He was trying to burn her credibility so completely that when she fell, no one would defend her. And he wasn't working alone anymore. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Isaiah came running. "Riders," he said, "more than before, different roads, coordinated." Grace stepped onto the porch. In the distance, dust rose in 3 directions, not rushing, advancing. She handed the folder to Isaiah. "If I don't come back inside," she said, "this goes north, all of it." Isaiah swallowed. "You planning on not coming back?" Grace looked out at the land one more time. "I'm planning on ending something," she said. The first horn sounded from the far tree line, not a warning, a signal, and Grace knew with cold certainty that this wasn't intimidation anymore. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the moment where someone would either lose everything or finally take control of the whole board. The horn didn't rush them. That was the part that mattered. If this was panic, they'd be screaming in. If this was revenge, they'd be shooting already. But this was something cleaner, coordinated, measured, professional hatred. Grace stepped off the porch and into the yard where everyone could see her. Workers gathered without being called, not in a line, not organized, but ready. Isaiah moved to her side, rifle in hand. "You don't have to stand out front," he said low. Grace shook her head. "If I hide now," she said, "they own the story." The riders appeared slowly from the tree line. Not all at once, first 3. Then more, spreading wide, cutting exits, boxing the land without touching it yet. Grace counted again, too many, and still no Richard. That told her everything. This wasn't his show anymore. A man rode forward alone, older, confident, his horse calm like it had done this before. No hood this time, no fear either. He stopped just short of the fence line. "Grace Blackwood," he called, not yelling. Projecting, Grace didn't answer right away. Silence is a language, you don't waste it. Finally, she spoke. "You're on private land." The man smiled. "We know." He glanced around at the cabins, the people, the smoke scars still dark on the ground. "You've made things complicated," he continued. "Men like order, predictability." Grace stepped closer. "And men like you profit from chaos," she said. His smile tightened. "Men like me," he replied, "clean up after chaos." That's when Grace understood. These weren't just night riders. These were fixers. Men who existed to end problems quietly so the respectable world didn't have to see the mess. "You're not here for the land," Grace said. "No," he agreed. "We're here for you." Behind him, riders shifted, hands near triggers, waiting for a word. Grace felt the weight of every eye behind her, every person who'd chosen to stay, to believe. She thought of the folder, the letters already sent, the truth that would surface if she fell, and she realized something sharp and steady. They needed her alive long enough to disappear. Dead would make noise. Alive, broken, erased would make the lesson. The man spoke again. "You walk away," he said. "Tonight, quiet, take the child, leave the land untouched." "And if I don't?" His eyes went cold. "Then this place becomes an example." Grace nodded slowly. She turned her head slightly, just enough to speak without being heard by the men in front. "Get them back," she said to Isaiah. "All of them, now." Isaiah hesitated. "And you?" Grace didn't look at him. "I'll buy time." Isaiah understood what that meant. His jaw tightened. Then he moved fast, signaling others, pulling people back toward the cabins. The riders noticed the shift. The leader raised his hand. Grace stepped forward again, alone now. "You think this ends clean," she said. "It won't." The man shrugged. "History disagrees." Grace met his gaze, calm as ever. "So does the future." Somewhere far off, a sound carried on the air. Not hooves, not horns, something deeper, heavier. The leader frowned. Grace smiled, because she knew that sound, and whatever was coming next was going to force someone here to make a decision they couldn't take back. The question wasn't who would fire first. It was who would still be standing. When the noise finally arrived, the sound grew louder, steel on dirt. Wheels, commands carried by men who didn't ask permission. The riders heard it now. You could see it in the way their horses shifted, in the way confidence leaked out through tightened grips and narrowed eyes. The leader didn't turn around. That told Grace he already knew what it was. Union wagons, more than before, not rushed, not sloppy, the kind of arrival meant to be seen. Thornton hadn't just sent attention, he'd sent timing. The leader finally spoke, voice still calm but thinner now. "You planned this." Grace didn't answer, because planning is only impressive if you admit it. The wagons crested the far rise, blue coats catching the light. Armed, documented, official enough to ruin reputations if things went sideways. The riders began to peel back, slow, reluctant. Men like this don't fight armies, they fight shadows. The leader lifted a hand, signaling withdrawal, not defeat, postponement. Before he turned his horse, he looked at Grace one last time. "You made this public," he said. "That was your mistake." Grace held his gaze. "No," she said, "that was my insurance." He smiled once, cold, professional. "Insurance runs out." Then he was gone, taking his men with him, disappearing the same way they'd arrived, quiet, practiced, unfinished. The Union officer dismounted and approached Grace, face tight. "You all right?" Grace nodded, "For now." He looked around at the land, the people slowly emerging again from hiding. "This won't stop them," he said. Grace met his eyes. "I know." Night fell heavy after that, too heavy. The kind that presses on your ears. Grace stood alone in her office, lantern lit low. The folder sat open on the desk, names staring back at her like ghosts waiting for orders. Isaiah knocked once, then entered. "They gone," he said, "for tonight." Grace closed the folder. "Tonight is all we ever get," she replied. Isaiah hesitated. "You can still leave," he said. "Take the boy, let the land go." Grace looked toward the room where Thomas slept. "Then they win twice," she said. "Once with fear, once with memory." Isaiah nodded slowly. Outside an owl cried, far off, lonely. Grace felt it again, that pressure. That sense of being measured by someone patient enough to wait months, years, lifetimes. This wasn't over, not even close. Because men like the ones who rode away don't forget women who stand in their way. They adapt. They learn. And next time they won't come for land or reputation or leverage. Next time they'll come for the one thing Grace couldn't replace. And as she blew out the lantern and stepped into the dark, Grace understood the truth of the game she'd entered. Winning once doesn't end a war. It just tells the enemy exactly who to aim for next. Grace moved Thomas into the back room before dawn, not quietly, deliberately, because hiding looks like fear and fear invites tests. She placed him where walls were thick, where windows didn't give easy sightlines, where only people she trusted knew the rhythm of the house. Then she sat with him for a long minute, watching his chest rise and fall. This whole war started over that breath. Outside, the plantation woke slow. Workers returned to fields, eyes scanning tree lines more than soil. Guards rotated. Dogs stayed alert, hackles up like they knew something hadn't finished speaking yet. By mid-morning, the first consequence arrived. A banker in town withdrew credit. No explanation, just procedure. An hour later, a cotton broker delayed pickup. Weather, he said, even though the sky was clean. By noon, a merchant refused delivery outright. Grace smiled when she heard. Pressure like this means the other side is regrouping, not winning. Thornton arrived shortly after, coat dusty, jaw tight. "They're squeezing," he said. trying to make the land bleed. Grace nodded. They can starve the plantation, he continued. Slow, respectable. No violence. Grace leaned back. That only works if people panic. Thornton studied her, and if they don't. Then it forces the next move, Grace said. That afternoon she gathered the workers again. No speeches, no promises, just truth. They'll try to choke us without touching us, she said. Money, supplies, access. Murmurs followed, fear, anger, fatigue. Grace let it run its course, then raised her hand. Anyone who wants to leave, she said, can leave today with pay, with papers, no judgment. Silence fell harder than any threat. No one moved. That mattered. At dusk, a boy ran up from the far fence line, breathless. Someone's out there again, he said. Not riding, just watching. Grace felt it settle in her spine. She didn't grab a gun. She grabbed her coat. At the edge of the property, near the same place as before, a figure stood half hidden by trees. No horse, no hood, just a man leaning against a trunk like he had all the time in the world. Grace stopped well short of him. You're bold, she said. He chuckled softly. Bold men don't stand still, he replied. Patient ones do. She recognized the voice, not the leader from before, someone higher. You've cost people money, he continued. Reputation, control. Grace crossed her arms. And you're here to invoice me. He smiled, finally stepping into the open. Clean, ordinary, forgettable. No, he said. I'm here to explain the future. Grace met his eyes. I already live in it. He shook his head. No, he said calmly, you're borrowing time. He gestured toward the house. Toward where Thomas slept. We don't need to touch you, he went on. We just need you tired, watching, waiting. Grace didn't blink. And if I don't get tired? His smile faded. Then someone else will pay for it. He stepped back into the trees, voice carrying just enough to cut. You can guard land, he said. You can't guard tomorrow. Grace stood there long after he was gone, the words settling heavy. Because this time the threat wasn't loud. It wasn't immediate. It was strategic. And as she turned back toward the house, Grace understood the shift with brutal clarity. They weren't coming for her next. They were going to wait until she looked away. And when she did, they'd take something that couldn't be fought back into place. Grace didn't chase the man into the trees. Chasing is what prey does. She went back to the house, closed the door, and changed the board. By sunrise, messengers were moving, not riders in the open, walkers, church men, women carrying baskets with notes stitched into hems, the kind of network that doesn't look like power until it moves all at once. If they were going to wait her out, she'd make waiting expensive. Thornton received a letter before noon, then another, then 3 more from different hands saying the same thing in different ways. Funds were shifting, quietly, northward, away from men whose names were starting to feel radioactive. By afternoon, the banker who'd pulled credit sent word. Terms could be reconsidered. Grace didn't answer. Let silence do some work. Isaiah brought troubling news just before dusk. A patrol spotted Richard, he said. Not near here, 2 towns over. Grace looked up. Doing what? Isaiah hesitated. Talking, he said, to the wrong kind of men. Grace nodded slowly. That confirmed it. Richard wasn't the threat anymore. He was the door. That night Grace sat alone at her desk, the final folder open again. She added one more name, then another, patterns tightening, lines connecting. She wasn't building a defense now. She was mapping an exit for her enemies. A soft knock came at the door. Esther stepped in, face pale. They've been asking about the boy, she said. In town, real casual. Grace's hand stopped mid-page. Who? Men who don't say who they work for, Esther replied. But they know his name. The room went still. This wasn't a threat anymore. This was confirmation. Grace closed the folder carefully and locked it away. From now on, she said, voice low and absolute, Thomas doesn't leave this house. Ever. Not without me. Esther nodded, fear sharp in her eyes. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees like whispers passing messages. Grace stood and went to the window, scanning the dark beyond the fields. She could feel it now. the patience, the way the enemy had stopped pushing and started positioning. They weren't trying to scare her into running. They were setting up a moment where she'd have to choose the land or the child. And Grace knew deep down that the next move wouldn't come with horns or fire or riders in the open. It would come disguised as normal, as routine, as a single moment where everyone's guard dropped just long enough for the game to demand its price. Normal is the most dangerous disguise there is. The next morning came quiet, too quiet. No riders, no messengers, no smoke, just birds and sun and the sound of work starting like any other day. Grace didn't trust it for a second. She watched the yard from the upper window while Thomas slept, counting faces, counting steps, counting what didn't belong. Everything looked right, which meant something wasn't. By midday, the routine held. Wagons passed on the road without stopping. A neighbor tipped his hat from a distance. A merchant's boy delivered flour with no delay and no comment. That's when Grace felt it. The release. The way tension loosens when people think the storm has moved on. She went downstairs and stopped halfway. The house smelled different, not smoke, not blood, soap, fresh, someone had cleaned. Grace moved slow now, every sense tuned sharp. She checked the doors, locked. Windows secured, nothing forced, nothing broken. That scared her more than any kick-in ever had. Esther came from the kitchen, wiping her hands. "Food's ready," she said. "Thomas just woke." Grace studied her face. Calm, familiar, trusted, too trusted. Grace walked past her without a word and opened the back room door. Empty. The crib stood where it always had. Blanket folded, no Thomas. For half a heartbeat the world went silent. Then Grace breathed, slow, controlled. Panic is what they wanted. Panic makes mistakes. She turned back to Esther, voice steady enough to lie with. "Where's the boy?" Esther blinked. I thought he was with you." Grace nodded once. That answered everything. Someone had moved through this house like they belonged here, like they'd done it before, like they'd planned it down to the minute Grace's attention would slip. Grace didn't shout. She didn't run. She walked to the desk and unlocked the final drawer. Inside was the last letter she'd prepared but never sent. She took it out, folded it once, and handed it to Isaiah, who had appeared in the doorway, already reading her face. "Get this north," she said. "If I don't come back by nightfall, you send everything." Isaiah's hands shook. "You think they took him?" Grace met his eyes. "They didn't take him," she said. "They're borrowing him." Outside, a wagon rolled slowly down the road. Ordinary, covered. Moving at a pace meant not to draw attention. Grace stepped onto the porch and watched it disappear past the trees. She knew the rule now. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an invitation. And whatever waited at the end of that road wasn't going to ask for land or money or silence. It was going to ask Grace to choose who she was willing to become. To get her son back. Grace didn't chase the wagon, that's what they expected. Instead, she stood on the porch and memorized the road, the way dust settled, the way the birds went quiet after it passed, the direction it leaned when it hit the bend past the oak line. Kidnappers who expect panic plan for speed. Kidnappers who plan for leverage expect patience. Grace went inside and closed the door behind her. Not hard, not dramatic, final. She gathered only what mattered: papers, a pistol, one clean dress. No money. Money leaves trails, respect doesn't. Isaiah followed her, voice tight. "You can still call soldiers." Grace shook her head. They didn't take him to negotiate with uniforms. She sat at the desk and wrote 3 lines, short, sharp, addressed to 3 different people. "If you hear from me, it worked. If you don't, use everything." She sealed them without ceremony. Then she looked at Isaiah. "They'll be watching the road," she said, "not the creek path." Isaiah's eyes widened. "You going alone?" Grace adjusted her coat. "Alone is quieter." She left through the back, cutting through land she knew better than her own reflection. The creek path twisted through trees and low ground, hidden from wagons, hidden from men who only knew roads because roads were built for them. Grace moved steady, not fast. She wasn't hunting. She was confirming. Near dusk, she reached the abandoned outbuilding by the old mill, the place nobody used anymore because it smelled like rot and memory. The kind of place you hide something you don't want found quickly. She stopped short. There were tracks, fresh. A wagon had been there. Grace crouched, touched the ground, felt the weight of it, not staying long, transfer point. She straightened just as a voice came from behind her. "You came exactly when we thought you would." Grace didn't turn. "Then you don't know me as well as you think." A man stepped into view, not armed, not nervous. Same one from the trees days earlier, patient. "Where is my son?" Grace asked. The man smiled slightly. "Safe," he said, "for now." Grace finally turned to face him. "What do you want?" The man tilted his head. "Not what you think," he said. "This stopped being about land weeks ago." He stepped closer. "You embarrass people who don't forgive," he continued. "People who can't let an example stand." Grace's voice stayed calm. "So you steal a child." "We remove distractions," he corrected, "so choices can be made clearly." Grace felt it then, the trap tightening. "Here's the choice," the man said. "You step away, publicly, quietly. Leave the plantation leaderless long enough for order to return." "And my son?" He smiled again. "You do that," he said, "and he grows up never knowing how close he came to disappearing." Grace held his gaze. "And if I don't?" The man's smile faded. "Then you'll learn how patient we really are." From somewhere deeper in the trees, a baby cried. Not loud, not panicked, alive. Grace's chest tightened, but her face didn't move. She understood the final truth now. This wasn't about winning. It was about what she was willing to sacrifice to end the game. And as the light bled out of the sky and the man waited for her answer, Grace realized whatever she said next would decide who she would be remembered as. A woman who protected the future. Or a symbol they made an example of. Grace didn't answer him right away. That bothered him. Men who deal in ultimatums expect panic, bargaining, or rage. Silence throws off their timing. Silence forces them to wonder if they've miscalculated. The baby cried again, softer this time, close, very close. Grace kept her eyes on the man. "You said this wasn't about land," she said calmly. "So stop pretending this is a negotiation." He studied her, reassessing. "You're smarter than most," he admitted. "That's why you're dangerous." Grace nodded once. "And you're not the one in charge," she said. "That's why you're talking instead of acting." The man's jaw tightened, just a fraction. Grace stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You didn't take my son to force me to leave," she continued. "If that's all you wanted, you'd have done it already." She took another step. "You took him to see if I'd break." The man didn't deny it. Grace exhaled slowly. "Here's the part you don't understand," she said. "I've been owned before, threatened before, cornered before." She met his eyes, steady. "I don't make decisions under fear." From the trees behind him, another figure shifted. Watching, measuring, Grace saw it, the real audience. "So here's my answer," she said. "You don't get the land, you don't get silence, and you don't get my son." The man's tone hardened. "Then this ends badly." Grace shook her head. "No," she said, "this ends publicly." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper, holding it up where both men could see. "You're standing on land that's already been written about," she said. "Names, roots, funding, everything." The man laughed once, sharp. "You think paper scares us?" Grace smiled, not warm. "I think timing does." From the road beyond the trees came the sound of horses, not charging, arriving more than before. The man's eyes flicked sideways. Grace spoke one last time before the moment broke. "You have one move left," she said. "Give him back or become the proof." The baby's cry stopped suddenly. Too suddenly. And Grace knew the next seconds were going to decide whether this ended with a return or with blood. Part 23. The woods erupted in motion. Not chaos, calculation. The man in front of Grace stepped back, hand raised, signaling something she couldn't see. Somewhere deeper, someone answered. A moment passed. Then Thomas cried again, closer this time. Grace's breath stayed even. That was important because fear makes you rush. And rushing was how they lost control of people like her. A woman emerged from the trees holding the child, not rough, not gentle either, professional, like this was a task, not a crime. She handed Thomas forward. Grace didn't move until the baby was placed in her arms, warm, alive, safe. That was the moment the balance shifted. Grace looked up. "You're done," she said. The man's face hardened. "No," he replied. "You just became more expensive to kill." What? Grace stepped back with Thomas, eyes never leaving him. "You can try," she said, "but understand something first." The horses reached the clearing now. Union Blue, Northern men, witnesses. Grace raised her voice, not shouting, projecting. "This man," she said, pointing, "is part of an organized effort to intimidate, abduct, and destabilize legally held property under federal oversight." She didn't accuse, she documented. "You move against me now," she continued, "and every letter I sent becomes testimony." The man stared at her, really stared now. "You won't always have soldiers," he said. Grace adjusted Thomas on her shoulder. "No," she said, "but I won't always be alone either." He smiled thinly. "Neither will we." He stepped back into the trees, disappearing without another word. No threats, no drama. That's how professionals retreat. Grace watched until the forest swallowed him. The Union officer approached. "You all right?" he asked. Grace nodded. "My son is." That was the only answer that mattered. But as she turned back toward the plantation, Grace knew something had changed. They hadn't lost, but they had learned. And men like that don't forgive lessons, they remember them. Part 24, Final. The plantation survived. That's the part history remembers. What it doesn't always record is the cost of surviving. Richard Blackwood disappeared not long after. No trial, no body, just rumors and silence. Margaret moved north and never spoke Grace's name again, not in public, not where it could be heard. The men behind the threats didn't vanish. They adjusted. Grace adjusted faster. She fortified quietly, built alliances that didn't need permission, spread ownership, spread loyalty, made the land bigger than herself. That's how you make something untouchable. Thomas grew up knowing two things: that his mother never flinched, and that power doesn't shout, it positions. Years later, people would say Grace won, that she beat impossible odds, that she changed the rules, but Grace knew better. She didn't win. She outlasted. And in a world designed to erase people like her, that was the most dangerous move of all, because everyone who tried to break her learned the same lesson too late. Grace Blackwood didn't just see the game. She learned how to make the board afraid to move.